I want to go through some highlights from this lesson. I'm not going to do the whole lesson because it would take a while, but I just want to highlight a couple of things. Okay, so the new unit is metabolic functions, and what's us looking at the main reactions that cells use in order to convert energy into the different forms. So when we eat food, we're bringing in energy that's in the form of food. It's a type of chemical energy, but we need to convert it into a chemical energy that our cells can use, which is known as ATP. Okay, and so in our food there are chemical bonds holding together the macromolecules you saw in the first unit, and when those bonds are broken, the energy that's stored in those bonds can be used to convert into the energy of forming new bonds known as ATP, and ATP is like the energy for the cell. So if you think of like your computer is run on electrical energy, your cells are run on chemical energy called ATP. Okay, so the main primary molecule for energy in cells is glucose. Okay, so sugar is the main one. All the different macromolecules can be used for energy because they all have stored energy in the bonds between the carbons, hydrogens, oxygens, etc. The overall equation for cellular respiration is glucose plus oxygens gives you carbon dioxide and water. So if you see over here on the left, we have glucose and oxygen, which if you look, you have 1 glucose and 6 oxygen. There's 7 molecules over here. And over here on the right, we have carbon dioxide and water. Oh, actually, carbon dioxide and water. We have 6 carbon dioxides and 6 water molecules. So we have 7 molecules over here and 12 molecules over here. So there's actually more. So we see there's more molecules over here because you've taken that large glucose molecule and broken it into smaller pieces. In the breaking of those bonds, you're releasing energy that can be used to form an energy known as ATP. So ATP is kind of on here. It's not part of this reaction. This reaction happens because this reaction happened. So this ATP should kind of be underneath. I can't draw on this. I don't have a tablet, so sorry, I can't do this lesson how I'd like to do it if I was actually in the classroom. Okay. All right, so ATP is formed in different ways. There's something known as, okay, so this is ATP here. Okay, so ATP, as I said, is the energy molecule used by cells. So here's an ATP. It's kind of like what we call like a charged battery. When ATP is used in a reaction, so say there's a reaction like, if you remember, active transport. So transporting molecules against their concentration gradient. Okay, that requires an input of energy. That input of energy is ATP. So when a component in a cell needs energy, an ATP, what will happen to ATP molecule is one of the phosphates. See how there's 1, 2, 3 phosphates on here? That's why it's called ATP, adenosine triphosphate. So it's a nucleotide. Kind of remember from the first unit, one of the macromolecules was nucleic acids, and if you remember from grade 11, there were 4 nucleotides: adenine, guanine, thymine, and cytosine. Adenosine is similar to adenine. Okay, so it's a nucleotide. It's got 1, 2, 3 phosphates on it. This phosphate on the end is a high energy phosphate. So when it's broken off, it releases energy. That energy is now used by the cell to move something, say, against the concentration gradient. Now it's a dead battery. Okay, we need to recharge this battery in order to reuse it again. Okay, how does that happen? Well, a phosphate has to be added back onto the ADP to make ATP again. Okay, that happens from the breakdown of glucose into carbon dioxide and water. Okay, so how are those formed? So if you have your book open to page 125, you notice down towards the bottom, you'll see a molecule called phosphoenol pyruvate, PEP. Okay, and if you notice this reaction, you'll see when you have a PEP that gets converted into a pyruvate, you make an ATP. How does that happen? Well, all the reactions that happen in glycolysis, actually all the reactions that happen in a cell, they all happen because there's an enzyme facilitating the reaction. So every one of those steps in those glycolysis reactions involves an enzyme. Okay, and so the steps in which an ATP is formed, there's a phosphate on one part of the molecule of that original glucose. Okay, so as that glucose is getting broken down, these are all the steps. The step we're looking at right now is one down here near the end where the PEP is being converted into pyruvate. It's not converted into CO2 because that's not part of glycolysis. That happens after when we get into the next two reactions. Okay, so the phosphate gets transferred over to an ADP to make ATP, and that's how the ATP is made. This is known as substrate level phosphorylation. There's different ways that ATP are made. Okay, and those are how all the ATP are made in the glycolysis reactions. I'm not going to go through every part of the glycolysis reactions just because they're just steps. Normally I would have the class, you'd have to sort of memorize all of the different molecules. So from glucose to glucose 6-phosphate, fructose 6-phosphate, all the way down to pyruvate, knowing all those steps. But obviously this is a different world we're living in right now, so I'm not going to get you to do that. So overall, what's happening in cellular respiration, the part that I had you learn last week was this part right here. We have glucose getting converted into pyruvic acid. So the CO2, that comes from the Krebs cycle and something kind of in between glycolysis and the Krebs cycle called pyruvate oxidation. That's this part in here that you don't see in this picture, but it's in your textbook. That's where the CO2s are made, and then the water is made at the end in this thing called the electron transport chain. But this is the part we're going to focus on right now. Okay, so these ATP here and these ATP here, they're all made through this thing known as substrate level phosphorylation. Okay. Now, ATP is also made in the electron transport chain. That is a different process, which I'll get into in a second. So overall, here's glycolysis again. You have a glucose, a 6-carbon glucose. See, it gets broken. You have to input some ATP into the beginning. Okay, so energy is needed to get this reaction started, kind of like a spark. Okay, this molecule ends up getting broken into these two pieces. You make this thing called NADH, which I'm going to talk about in a second. Okay, and as it gets converted and changed and reorganized, where we make 2 ATP from this half of that original glucose and 2 ATP from this half of that original glucose. So overall, in this reaction, we make 2 ATP. Now, in terms of energy for a cell, that's not enough energy for a cell to survive. Okay, this is just kind of a start. Okay. There's all the steps. Again, I would normally get you to know them, but I'm not going to worry too much about it. All right. The next part of the process of cellular respiration happens in the organelle called the mitochondria. Now, you probably remember from maybe even from elementary school. I was going to say from grade 10, but even from elementary school, that the mitochondria is known as the powerhouse of the cell. Okay, it's the powerhouse of the cell because this is where the majority of the energy is made. So the rest of cellular respiration, the Krebs cycle, pyruvate oxidation, and electron transport chain all happens inside the mitochondria. Okay, the mitochondria has 2 membranes, an outer membrane and an inner membrane. The inner membrane is important for electron transport chain. And then inside would be kind of like analogous to like the cytoplasm of a cell, this blue part. This is known as the matrix. That's where the Krebs cycle happens and pyruvate oxidation happens. Okay, pyruvate oxidation is also known as the intermediate reaction, but whatever. So the 2 pyruvate that came from glycolysis, see how there's 1, 2, 3 carbons, because remember that original 6-carbon glucose is broken into 2 3-carbon molecules, and at the end of glycolysis we had what was called pyruvate. Okay, so we have 3 carbons here. There's 2 of them because that glucose had 6 and it was broken in half. Okay, and we make a couple of, see at the end we only have 2 carbons. We had 3 here, now over here we have 2. That means we release some as CO2. Okay, so again, that goes back to this original right here. We had 1 glucose. We're going to have to eventually make 6 carbon dioxide. Now we've made 2. Okay, and we made this thing called NADH, which again, I'll get back to. Okay, so now those molecules enter into what is known as the Krebs cycle, which I'm not going to get into. Actually, I'll show this one instead. Okay, so the pyruvic acid, this is where it just happened, is made into this, it's known as acetyl-CoA. Okay, so all this thing's going to happen twice. So the Krebs cycle starts with a 4-carbon molecule known as oxaloacetate. That's what this thing is right here. I don't care if you know what that means. This 2-carbon thing gets attached to the 4-carbon to make what's known as a citric acid. Okay, the Krebs cycle is named after the guy who discovered it, Hans Krebs. It's also known as citric acid cycle because we make something called citric acid. It can also be known as citrate. Citric acid and citrate are the same thing, like pyruvate and pyruvic acid are the same thing. It's just a different naming system. So the short way of saying pyruvic acid would be calling it a pyruvate. Sorry, I'm throwing a lot at you right now, and I know that's not great. Normally I would do this lesson probably like 3 times in class. All right, so when we made that acetyl-CoA gets attached, we make the citric acid. Don't care if you know, but the original 2 carbons here, one of them gets released as carbon dioxide, another one gets released as carbon dioxide, and then we remake the oxaloacetate, and then the other acetyl-CoA will attach to it, and the same process will happen again. It's not exactly how it goes, but just bear with me. Okay, and now we've made all the CO2s from that original reaction. But the important thing is we made some more ATP, and we made these things known as NADH. Okay, and I will pause. I will stop there, and I'm going to do a lesson on what NADH is and electron transport is a little bit later, and I'll probably post it today or tomorrow. Okay.